On a cold winter morning in 1921, a watchman on the North Carolina coast saw something that made no sense at all. A great five-masted schooner sat hard aground on the shoals, every sail still raised and full, leaning into the surf as if she were still mid-voyage. Yet no one answered the long calls from shore. Her name was the Carroll A. Deering, a large commercial sailing schooner built for the long ocean trades. On the morning of the 31st of January, she was spotted stranded on the Diamond Shoals, the treacherous sandbars off Cape Hatteras. Everything about her looked ordinary, almost peaceful, except that she had come to rest exactly where no careful captain would ever steer. The Diamond Shoals had earned a grim nickname over the centuries. Sailors called these waters the graveyard of the Atlantic, where shifting sand and sudden storms had swallowed countless ships. Yet the Deering had not splintered or sunk. She simply sat there, intact and abandoned, like a riddle left half-spoken on the water. To understand the mystery, you have to know the voyage that came before it. The Deering had sailed far to the south, carrying a heavy load of coal all the way down to Rio de Janeiro. After unloading there, she turned for home, bound for Norfolk, Virginia, with a stop along the way at the warm island port of Barbados. Aboard her were roughly 10 men, though the accounts disagree on the exact number. They were ordinary sailors and officers, men with families waiting and wages owed, working a long and tiring passage. None of them could have guessed that their names would be remembered a century later, not for anything they did, but for the way they would all simply disappear. And the voyage had not gone smoothly from the start. The original captain, a man named William Merritt, had fallen ill somewhere along the way. He was too sick to continue, so he was put ashore to recover, leaving the great schooner suddenly in need of a new master to bring her safely home. A veteran sailor stepped in to take command. His name was Willis Wormel, an older and deeply experienced captain, trusted to steer the schooner through her final stretch. Serving as his first mate was a man named Charles McClellan. On paper, it was a capable crew, but beneath the surface, something was already beginning to strain. When the ship reached Barbados, that strain reportedly slipped into the open. In a portside bar, the first mate was overheard complaining bitterly about the captain. His words hinted at tension and resentment aboard, the kind of quiet conflict that can grow dangerous in the close, endless world of a ship at sea. On the 28th of January, the Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship, a small vessel anchored offshore to guide passing ships. It was the last clear sighting of her before she ran aground. The lightship keeper watched her glide by, and what he saw would later become one of the strangest pieces of the whole puzzle. A man aboard the Deering called out across the water through a megaphone. He shouted that the ship had lost her anchors in a storm, and he asked that the owners be told, but the keeper noticed something wrong. He described the speaker as a tall, thin man with reddish hair and a foreign accent, and that man did not look or sound like one of the ship's officers at all. There was something stranger still. As the schooner passed, the keeper saw the rest of the crew gathered loosely on the quarterdeck, the raised rear deck of the ship. On a vessel like the Deering, that part of the deck was the captain's domain, an area normally reserved for officers alone. To see ordinary sailors milling about there was a small wrongness that he would never forget. That small detail planted a heavy suspicion. To the people who later studied the case, it suggested that the chain of command aboard the Deering may have already broken down. Perhaps the crew had risen against their captain. Perhaps the order of the ship had quietly collapsed somewhere out on that dark and lonely sea, days before she ever reached the shoals. Now picture the morning she was found, wedged on the shoals with all her sails still set. The sea around her was furious. For days, rough water and breaking surf kept every rescue boat at bay. The men on shore could only watch the silent ship and wonder who, if anyone, was still alive aboard her. At last, around the 4th of February, the seas calmed enough for a rescue vessel to reach her. Boots finally climbed over the rail and onto the slanting deck of the Carroll A. Deering. The men braced themselves for whatever they might find. What they discovered was not violence and not wreckage. It was something far more unsettling. The ship was completely deserted. Every cabin, every passage, every corner stood empty. The entire crew were simply gone. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle on the open deck, no last desperate message left behind. Only the wind moving through the rigging and the hush of an empty vessel. Then the searchers reached the galley, the ship's kitchen, and there the silence grew louder. Food had been laid out, or was in the middle of being prepared, as if for the very next meal. It looked for all the world as though the cook had stepped away for only a moment and would walk back in at any second. If the crew had walked away from a half-made meal, where on earth had they gone? The answer, when the searchers looked closer, only deepened the mystery. Certain things were missing from the ship, and the careful pattern of what was taken suggested the men had not vanished in a single sudden instant after all. Both of the ship's lifeboats were gone. So were the crew's personal belongings gathered up and carried off. Missing too were the key navigation instruments, the ship's log, and the ship's papers. Even certain anchors had vanished from the bow. But the steering gear told a very different story. The ship's wheel had been shattered, the binnacle, the housing for the compass, had been smashed in, and the rudder had been knocked loose from its mounting. The very means of steering the ship had been violently destroyed. Think about what that picture suggests. People do not calmly pack their bags and lower two lifeboats in the middle of a sudden catastrophe. The careful removal of belongings and papers hinted at a planned, deliberate departure, yet the smashed steering gear hinted at violence or panic or a desperate struggle. The clues pointed in two opposite directions at once, and here the trail turns cold. No bodies were ever recovered. Neither of the two missing lifeboats was ever found, not drifting at sea, not washed up on any shore. The whole crew had stepped off a working ship into the winter Atlantic, and the ocean closed over them without leaving a single answer behind. Now this disappearance might have stayed a quiet local tragedy, a single lost ship mourned and forgotten. But it arrived at a strange and nervous moment, and that is where the story takes its first turn into something much larger and much harder to explain. Because the Deering was not alone. She was only one of a whole wave of ships that vanished or fell silent along that coast in a single uneasy season, roughly a dozen vessels lost or unaccounted for in the space of just a few months. So many losses in so short a time alarmed officials all the way up to the highest levels of government. What happened next was extraordinary for a single empty ship. 5 separate departments of the United States government joined forces to investigate. State, Commerce, Treasury, Navy, and Justice all turned their attention to the Carroll A. Deering. It became one of the largest maritime inquiries the country had ever launched. The investigators weighed several possibilities, each darker than the last. The first was mutiny. Given the tension in Barbados and the strange behavior on the quarterdeck, some believe the crew may have turned on Captain Wormel and seized the ship for themselves before something went badly wrong. The second theory was piracy. These were the early years of Prohibition, when rum-runners smuggled illegal liquor along the coast in fast, lawless boats. The inquiry considered whether such criminals might have boarded the Deering, overpowered her crew, and stripped her of anything useful before slipping away into the night. There was even a stranger fear at work in those years. The country was gripped by what was called the Red Scare, a deep anxiety about Bolshevik revolutionaries. For a time, some seriously wondered whether Bolshevik raiders might be seizing American ships at sea. It shows just how uneasy and suspicious the whole era had become. And of course, there was the simplest explanation of all: the sea itself. A sudden storm could have battered the schooner, broken her steering, and driven the frightened crew to abandon ship in the lifeboats, only to be swallowed by the very waves they hoped to escape. The ocean needs no motive to take a life. Each theory had its supporters. None of them had any proof. The investigation was circling with a deserted ship, a missing crew, and contradictory clues that refused to settle into a single story. And then, into this swirl came a clue that seemed almost too good to be true. In the spring of 1921, a fisherman walking the beach near Buxton, North Carolina, found a bottle in the sand. There was a note rolled up inside it, and the words on that note seemed to tear the whole mystery wide open. The message claimed that the Deering had been captured by an oil-burning boat. It said the crew were being held handcuffed, while the raiders stripped the ship of everything aboard. If it was real, it pointed straight at the piracy theory, and it suggested the missing men might somehow still be alive. The note caused a sensation. For months, it seemed the case might finally be cracked, and the search shifted toward hunting for the pirate ship that had supposedly seized the Deering. The story drew in the highest offices of government. An assistant to the Secretary of Commerce personally took charge of running the clue down, but here's the truth you must hold on to. When investigators finally traced the bottle back to its source, the whole thing fell apart. By the late summer of that year, the message was exposed as a complete hoax. The fisherman himself had written it. He had forged the note and planted the bottle, hoping the publicity might help him win a job at the local light station. And so the single most exciting clue in the entire case dissolved into nothing. It had cost months of effort and sent investigators chasing a ship that never existed. Worse, it had buried the honest, harder questions under a thrilling story that turned out to be a lie. The case was right back where it started, only emptier than before. So the great investigation pressed on without its most exciting clue. The departments compared notes, chased leads, and questioned witnesses across more than a year of patient work. But every promising thread led back to the same frustrating place. A deserted ship, a missing crew, and not one solid answer. In 1922, the inquiry quietly closed. After all that effort, the government reached no conclusion at all. The fate of the men was never determined. Mutiny, piracy, the Red Scare, a sudden storm. Every theory remained possible, and not one could ever be proven. The case was simply, honestly, left unsolved. In the years that followed, the Carroll A Deering drifted into a different kind of story. Her name was swept up into the legends of the Bermuda Triangle, where she became proof of strange and supernatural forces. But that is later folklore, not evidence. The real mystery needs no myth at all to remain haunting. So we are left where the investigators were left more than a century ago. A magnificent ship found whole, with her sails set and a meal half made. 2 lifeboats gone, the crew gone, and the wide Atlantic keeping its silence. Whatever happened in those final hours sailed away with them, and the sea has never told. Thank you for drifting through this quiet mystery with me tonight. If the silence of that empty ship has settled gently over you, stay a while longer, and let me carry you into more of the world's unsolved stories. Rest easy now, and let the slow tide of these mysteries rock you softly. Sleep well.